Hi, this is Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm finishing up a pair of fingerless mitts like this one, and I'm at the point that I just need to add the top section here of my thumb. And a lot of knitters find adding the thumb to a glove or a mitten a little bit intimidating because it's really easy to get holes right across here when you pick up the stitches between the thumb gusset and the hand. So today I'd like to show you the technique I use to minimize those gaps and holes. So the first thing we need to do is transfer our held gusset stitches onto knitting needles. And I'm using double pointed needles, but if you're more comfortable with magic loop, you can use circular needles as well. And as you're transferring your stitches, just make sure that you're going through the center of each stitch parallel to that piece of waste yarn. That last stitch can be a little bit tricky. So once all your stitches are transferred onto your knitting needles, you can just simply pull out the waste yarn, and then we're ready for the next step. Now that our stitches are transferred, we're going to join our new yarn. So to do that, you're going to go to the last stitch that you transferred onto your needles, and you're going to insert another needle into the stitch directly below to the one that's on your needle now. So let me pull this in closer. So you're just going to insert your needle right through below the last stitch. Wrap your new yarn around that needle and then pull it through that lower stitch. And you want to position this loop on your knitting needle so that the tail side of the loop is coming over the front of the needle and the working yarn side is at the back. It takes a little bit here to figure out which one's which. So this is my tail side, so I want that coming over the front, and then the working yarn is at the back. And I'm just going to tighten that down. And you can see now I basically have two stitches coming out of that single lower stitch. And when I start knitting and get back to this, I'm going to consider both of these loops as one single stitch. Now that we've joined our yarn, we're ready to pick up stitches across the hand. So the trick here is to pick up one more stitch than you cast on across that gap. And for my mitts, I actually cast on one stitch, so I need to pick up two stitches across the gap. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn my work. And I'm turning it so that the fingers of the mitten would be facing towards me and the cuff is facing away. And now I need to look at the stitches here that start at the gap. So I'm looking for two columns of stitches that start at the gap, and the V of the column of stitches, the V is going to point towards me or towards the fingers of the mitt. So let's get really close up here. So here's the first column, here's the V stitch, the column starts in the gap, and the V's are pointing towards me. Here's the second column. It starts in the gap, and the V of the stitches is pointed towards me. So to pick up that first stitch, I'm actually going to use the knitting needle where the join is, and I'm going to insert my knitting needle into the top stitch of that column, and I want to make sure that there's two strands of yarn above my knitting needle. So here's the column, and there's two strands, and I'm going to go down into that hole. And then make sure you have your working yarn and not the tail. Just pick up a stitch through that hole. And now I need to pick up a stitch from the second column And again, I'm looking for the column of stitches that starts in the gap and the V points towards me. So it's that column there. And I need to make sure there's 2 strands above the needle. 1, 2, and then insert my needle in. And then I am going to, again, make sure you have your working yarn and not the tail. Pick up a stitch. And then I'm just going to continue working around my mitten. And now that you've picked up your stitches, you're just going to knit across the stitches that were held for your gusset. So I'm just knitting around the first round of my gusset stitches, and I'm almost back to where we joined our yarn. And when you get to the join, remember you're going to see 2 strands, 2 stitches coming out of one single lower strand. And just treat those 2 stitches as if they were one single stitch. So I'm just going to knit those together as if they were a single stitch. And then I'm going to knit the first stitch that I picked up across the hand. And once I do that, you can take your yarn tail, I'm going to set my needle aside here. You can take your yarn tail and just pull it gently, and you'll be able to feel your first picked up stitch and your join tighten up between your fingers. And after you do that, you can actually just push the yarn tail down through the thumb hole, and that just helps keep the tail out of the way as you work the rest of the thumb. So continue knitting around the thumb until the thumb is your desired length. So I finished knitting the top part of the thumb and I bound off the stitches at the top. So now let's take a closer look at where we picked up those stitches across the hand. And I'm going to turn my glove again so that the finger part is pointing towards me and that the cuff is away. And we're going to flip back the thumb so we can take a really close look here at where we picked up our stitches. The 2 stitches we picked up are right here, these 2 stitches. And you can see that they blend in really nicely between the thumb and the hand. Again, look for the column of stitches that's a V pointing towards you, and it just continues on. And here's the second column. The V is pointing towards us, and the stitches just blend in right there. It is still possible that you could have a small gap in the hand right here in between where the gusset and the hand are. And that can happen just when you are pulling your work, transferring your gusset stitches onto needles, or pulling the needles when you're picking up the stitches. It could change the tension of the yarn a little bit. The good news is it's really easy to close that gap. All you have to do is gently use your knitting needle to lift the strand that pulls the gap tighter, and then stitch by stitch, lifting one strand at a time, gradually lift and pull that yarn so that the tension evens out and you work it into the mitten all the way across. So you just keep pulling until you don't notice that there's a huge loop anymore. So I hope you enjoyed learning about how to knit the thumb of a mitten or a glove. And until next time, happy knitting.